entire Bhagavad Gita, for example, is about the dilemma that is faced by a warrior on the battlefield. You have elements of spirituality, you have elements of philosophy, and you have elements of strategic thought, and they all come together. I think what the Mahabharata does is to equip you with a much better understanding of
2nd April, we saw an attack at Pahalgam. What Krishna had done in such an instance?
Compare this with what Ashwathama does. Two people are sleeping in their camp. At the end of the slaughter, there is a very concerted campaign on part of the Pandavas to hunt down Ashwathama. While Arjun retracts, Ashwathama confesses that he does not have that capability. It does hit the target, unfortunately. Krishna is able to negate its effect. But what he also does is to curse Ashwathama, not of death, but of pain, through a life which is going to be a miserable life. That should tell us something about what the answer to this kind of barbaric behavior should be.
So the Mahabharata is often called the fifth Ved. It is because of the very, very expansive, detailed, deliberate, rich insights that the text can provide. It provides you with the philosophical underpinnings. It provides you with the strategic toolkit. So these are two very key issues.
Arthashastra comes before Mahabharata and then the Gita, because in terms of arth, that brings you power, and then the understanding of spirituality comes into your life.
If you were to study the Arthashastra, there is preeminence to the concept of arth. Whereas if you were to look at the Mahabharata, very clearly in the hierarchy, it is dharma which gains precedence over arth. Both texts make it amply evident that there is a very close inherent linkage between these two subjects.
Why should an individual, a policymaker, a military strategist, be inclined towards reading this book, sir?
So to my mind, this book is...
Today's episode takes us far beyond policy papers and military doctrines. It takes us into the world of longest epic, the Mahabharata. Because hidden in its verses are not just stories, but strategies about diplomacy, conflict, morality, and survival. Our guest today is Colonel Vivek Chadha, a soldier, scholar, and now author of Mahabharat Strategic Insights, Navigating the Dharmic Compass. His book is a groundbreaking attempt to show how Krishna's statecraft, the dilemmas of the Pandavas, and the principles of dharma can help us think about the challenges India faces today, from Pakistan and China to global power rivalries. In this conversation, we'll explore why the Mahabharata is the true foundation of India's strategic thought, what Krishna teaches about negotiation, timing, and power, and how those lessons apply to our world today of nuclear weapons, grey zone warfare, and contested geopolitics. This isn't just about history, it's about the choice leaders make when morality and necessity collide. So let's begin Mahabharata's Strategic Insights with Colonel Vivek Chadha, only on Diver Publisher. So without further ado, let's get started. Before we dive into today's conversation, I want to take a quick moment and ask for a favor. We noticed that 93% of you who watch our content regularly aren't subscribed yet. My promise to you is simple. If you hit that subscribe button, we'll keep working hard to bring thought-provoking conversations, incredible guests, and the topics you really care about the most. It is practically free for you, but it makes a huge difference for us, helping us grow, reach more people, and bring even better content your way. Thank you for supporting. It means the world to us. Now let's get back to the video.
Colonel Vivek Chadha, welcome again on Diary for Publisher.
Thank you.
Pleasure having a conversation with you on different subjects. Today we're going to be discussing your latest work, your book that we published recently. It's called Mahabharat Strategic Insights. It's one of one. You want to talk a little about it, and why should an individual, a policymaker, a military strategist, be inclined towards reading this book, sir?
So the Mahabharata is often called the fifth Ved. It is because of the very, very expansive, detailed, deliberate, rich insights that the text can provide. Hitherto, we've had most people talking about its storyline, which is one of the most interesting storylines that we have. We also have people who've looked at the spiritual aspects of the Mahabharata, more specifically the Bhagavad Gita, which is a part of it. We've had people look at the philosophical angle of the Mahabharata, where based on the idea of dharma, You have an entire philosophy that has, through centuries, that has been passed on. For me, the quest was more for gaining strategic understanding or seeking strategic significance of the text. Because I thought that compared to some of the other areas, this was relatively underexplored. Purely from the point of view of strategic planners, diplomats, military people, students of strategic studies, international relations, I think Mahabharata has as much value, if not more, than the Arthashastra. In fact, I would say that in a sense, these are two companion texts. The journey starts with the Mahabharata, and the baton, in a sense, is handed over when it comes to issues of statecraft to the Arthashastra. So there's a very close linkage between these two topics, and if one has to have a more comprehensive understanding of the subject, then I think one should commence the study with the Mahabharata and then move on to the Arthashastra.
But last time, I remember in our conversation, you stated that Arthashastra comes before Mahabharata and then the Gita, because in terms of Arth, that brings you power, and then the understanding of spirituality comes into your life as an individual or entity as well.
So, if you were to study the Arthashastra, there is preeminence to the concept of Arth. Whereas, if you were to look at the Mahabharata, very clearly in the hierarchy, it is dharma which gains precedence over Arth. Having said so, I think both texts make it amply evident that there is a very close inherent linkage between these two subjects. It's not as if one survives without the other, right? So, but purely from the Mahabharata's perspective, the preeminence is clearly given to dharma.
So it's Arth, Dharma, and then Moksha.
No, it's Moksha, Dharma, Arth, Kam. So that is, in a sense, the hierarchy. As far as the Mahabharata is concerned, if we just put aside Moksha for the time being, then in the hierarchy, it's Dharma, then Arth, and then Kam. While Dharma requires Arth as in a combination, but in terms of the importance, or you could say the underpinnings of how a king should rule his state, or in contemporary times, how the government should administer the state or the country, it's the ideals of dharma which should have preeminence as compared to the idea of or the importance of Arth.
So why should someone read this book, according to you?
So to my mind, this book is for the students of strategic studies. Like I mentioned, the entire spectrum of people, from students who are looking at these subjects, from people in uniform, to administrators, to diplomats. There's a very, very wide cross-section that it addresses. Beyond that, I think that given that there is a fairly deep discussion on the idea of dharma and how it's correlated to the text, the audience goes beyond this as well, because that is a much more generic theme as compared to more specific issues related to war, use of force, diplomacy.
So are you saying that after reading this book and understanding, Mahabharat Strategic Insights, you'll be able to make better decisions when it comes to, diplomacy or statecraft?
I think what the Mahabharata does is to equip you with a much better understanding of why you do certain things and how you should approach them. It provides you with the philosophical underpinnings. It provides you with the strategic toolkit. So these are two very key issues: philosophical underpinnings and the strategic toolkit. Now, once you have this with you, thereafter it's a question of applying it to a certain situation. So while it's not going to tell you what you need to do in situation A, B, or C, but it is giving you the grounding to better understand that reality and to take decisions accordingly.
Does this also include the psychological understanding of human beings?
It does. It certainly does, because the entire Bhagavad Gita, for example, is about the dilemma that is faced by a warrior on the battlefield, where on one side you have your duty as a warrior, and on the other side you have your very personal linkages with your elders, with your teachers, with your relatives, and then there is a dilemma that takes place. So it is a very difficult psychological dilemma that Arjun finds himself in. So like I said, you have elements of spirituality, you have elements of philosophy, and you have elements of strategic thought, and they all come together.
No, but when you speak about this psychological aspect of any principle that you speak about, the psyche of individual has changed over time because of the conditioning that the kind of world we live in. Do you think they have foreseen that change when it comes to the environment of individual in today's style and environment 4,000 years ago?
So instrumentalities have changed. The environment that we live in has evolved, but the fundamental principles of human existence, of human thought, they do not change. It's like when we talk of war, we often say that the nature of war is consistent, its character changes. Very similarly, humans, the core understanding and nature of a human being does not change. It adapts to the environment, changing environment that you live in. So, which beyond a point does not matter. The principles are always going to be more important than your specific solutions. If your principles are in place, the solutions will follow.
Got it. That answers pretty much, because you're saying that the basic need of a hierarchical need of a human doesn't change. That remains the same, but of course, the character changes. That's according to the environment you're living in. Having said that, sir, you are a senior research fellow at IDSA, the MP IDSA. It's a think tank, and you've been working on various different subjects, from financial support of militant groups, or other subjects that you counter-terrorism also you worked on. You've worked on change management as well. When did your cord struck when you decided to do your deep dive in the subject of Mahabharata, which is diverse in itself?
Manohar Parikar IDSA has been involved with indigenous studies for a very long time. It's been more than 15 years now, wherein we had taken a series of studies as an institution, as individuals. The focus primarily there was on a variety of themes and subjects, though to a great extent on the Arthashastra. What had always intrigued me was, why haven't we looked at the Mahabharata as a text to the extent that we should? And second, why isn't the character of Krishna, as we see it in the Mahabharata, being analyzed purely from the perspective of a strategic thought leader? Now, all these years, I was not a serious part of the past endeavors, but this seed had always been there in my mind. And eventually, I guess, a time came when this question that I had became a quest, and that quest led to my desire to undertake a very formal, structured research into the subject. And people were kind enough to give me that allowance.
Mm-hmm.
And when I commenced this search, I realized that there is a continuity in strategic thought which flows from the Mahabharata to subsequent texts. And this continuity can easily be traced over a period of almost 2,000 years, which somehow did not seem to have been noted with the kind of importance that it deserved. And as I went through, linking up those the relevant aspects, I also realized that beyond the strategic implications of that linkage, the fact that the Mahabharata also provides you with a certain spiritual guidance and a very robust philosophical insight, including the debates and differences that accompany it in the Mahabharata, which makes it a very unique and a very, very rich text. Something that I think in its entirety, I had never realized before. So for me, it was a journey, it was a revelation, it was a learning.
How long did it take you to go through the Mahabharata and derive some strategic thinking, strategic, thought process from it, the insights that you accumulated in this book of yours?
So it's taken me a little more than 4 years to undertake this project.
So 4 years. And how do you see yourself change in these 4 years, sir? From the time you started reading Mahabharata and then, doing your research on different aspects of it, how do you think you've changed over the last 4 years?
Having done this today, I realize that there is no way that someone who does a systematic research of the text from any perspective, it could be anything, will not come away uninfluenced by the text. For me, while I think all of us within the subcontinent, even beyond in some cases, may have heard the story. I think everybody is familiar with the story. But a deep dive into the text transforms you in some way or the other. So that has been the case as far as I'm concerned as well. Whether it's in terms of how I approach life, how I approach problems, how I look at the ancient legacy, the rich ancient legacy that we have, I think it's been a revelation.
Any examples of your change that you see in yourself, that the way you perceive the world or anything, situations around you has changed since you have got into this project?
There was a time when I had read that a great book is one which reinforces your convictions. Sometimes you may be aware of something, but you need somebody from the outside to reinforce it and convince you that, look, this is the right way. So on several accounts, the Mahabharata has done that for me. I'll give you a couple of examples. One example is the idea of detached perseverance. Now, as simple and as obvious as it seems, but the fact is that it's extremely difficult to pursue. It's extremely difficult to follow. But I think it is the essence of one of the takeaways of the Mahabharata, that if you can detach yourself from the goodies that you seek from a situation and continue to persevere with what you're supposed to do, it's related to the concept of nishkam karma, which the Gita talks about, the Mahabharata talks about. I think that, to my mind, is one of the biggest takeaways from the Mahabharata. The second is in terms of how did strategic decision-making, the flow of the strategic decision-making, how did it take place in the Mahabharata? While the steps of that decision-making process may be similar across different leaders, but if you look at how Krishna pursues it, I think that's an excellent takeaway, and it's interestingly very similar to how we follow it in the military. But it's a question of how well you do it rather than how you do it. Let me leave it with a question mark at the end to get some more questions on this from you.
You used Dr. Vivek Chadha's critical edition, which was a translation of Mahabharata, as an anchor for your analysis of this book.
Yeah.
Why was it essential to use that book as an anchor? So if you would want to add some points on it.
Yeah, sure. So I'm not a Sanskrit scholar. It's a limitation with which I began this quest. And I clearly realized that it does place some constraints on my very personal, individualized interpretation of the original text. When we say original text, one must take it with a pinch of salt, because there are several editions of the Mahabharata. The critical edition of the Mahabharata came from the Bhandarkar Institute. It's been a very, very long process wherein this endeavor was undertaken. So they commenced the process in 1919, finished in 1966, and as part of that, they collected different editions of the Mahabharata from across the country. Thereafter, they removed what they thought were some of the inaccuracies. and came up with what was called the critical edition. Now, this critical edition did not have an English translation till the time Vivek Chadha undertook this immense task. And it's not an easy task by any stretch of imagination. So his translation is the only English translation of the critical edition of the Mahabharata from the Bhandarkar Institute. So while I could have picked up others as well, it was my conscious decision to go with the critical edition of the Mahabharata, for which obviously it's Vivek Chadha who's single-handedly responsible for. Unfortunately, he is no more with us, but I think his legacy will continue to remain with us through the great work that he has done, not only in translating the Mahabharata, but also incidentally the Ramayana.
Is Bhagavad Gita part of Mahabharata? Have you covered a lot of principles from the Gita as well?
So while I have looked at that, but since my book is related to the strategic derivatives of the Mahabharata, it's only the strategic elements which I thought were relevant have been picked up from the Bhagavad Gita, and yes, to that extent, it is included.
What one strategic insight from the Bhagavad Gita?
There's a chapter I have on the concept of infinite thought. It has been spoken about by other thinkers like Simon Sinek. Kars has written a book on it in the mid-80s. But somehow I felt that the core of this idea is very familiar in relation to what the Bhagavad Gita says, which is that life ultimately is endless because your soul doesn't pass away. The body withers away. So to be too concerned with the body makes no sense, because there is going to be a cycle of rebirth. Now, the concept of the infinite idea takes off rather from the thought that there are certain rules of an infinite game, right? Where you have, it's like an open playbook. The timeline of what you're doing is infinite. The rules are infinite. They're not fixed. The players are infinite. And it's not the individual who matters more, but it is the continuation of that game which is more important. Now, this might seem a little abstract, so let me just try and explain this. When you have, let's say, let me take a specific example to try and explain it. We've been involved with counterterrorism, with insurgencies for a very, very long time. And we often say that the strongest weapon of the insurgent actually is time. And the intent of the insurgent is to tire out the forces, to tire out the state. And if the state does not defeat the insurgent, victory is automatically with the insurgent. Let's take some specific examples. The United States, before that, the Soviet Union was inducted into Afghanistan. Their forces were there. There was a very concerted, serious military attempt to defeat the so-called Mujahideen to begin with, subsequently the Taliban. In both cases, they were able to outlast what was considered the strongest military force on the face of earth. Now, the state had the disadvantage that they could only go there for a limited period of time. They were fighting based on certain rules of engagement. There was a very clear intent that they wanted to accomplish, and they were constrained by that. Look at what was applied by the opposing side. Time was on their side. The longer it lasted, the better it was for them. Every possible rule in the rule book of the military was challenged and broken. Individuals didn't matter. You could kill 10, 20, 50, 100 terrorists there, and it didn't affect the groups at all. So individuals didn't matter. And ultimately, they were able to outlast you. So there was the finite approach of the state, and there was the infinite approach of the insurgent. Right? Now, let us say if you were to reverse it. Look at India's approach to fighting insurgencies. The Naga insurgency began militarily,
say in 1955. It continues till date. What would have happened if we had given ourselves a very finite timeline to say, let's finish this in the next 10 years, that is my target? We would have been beaten. Time, as far as we are concerned, is our strength, and we're willing to stretch it to our advantage. In terms of the rules of engagements, while the army has very strict rules of engagement in terms of what it cannot do, but purely in terms of the adaptation and the innovation, we've allowed that kind of leeway to the state and the forces. So that, in a sense, is the contrast that I feel emerges from the concepts that have been outlined in the Bhagavad Gita.
Which is less philosophical but more strategic.
So yeah, this is the strategic insight that I take from the philosophical underpinnings of what the Bhagavad Gita says.
We must also talk about Krishna's decision calculus, which blends both idealism and realism. That's what your book mentions as well. What do you want to tell us more about how he makes the decision?
So the essence of dharma is that these are certain guidances which are meant to give you a certain norm, a certain regulation, a certain balance in your personal life as well as in the society.
A rule-based order, basically.
It's a rule-based order.
It's idealism.
It is idealism. All rule-based orders are ultimately based on certain norms, right? This does not constrain different forms of dharma when it comes to undertaking your responsibilities. For example, the Mahabharata says that the most important form of dharma is actually Raj Dharma, and that is the dharma of the ruler. Because ultimately, you need the ruler, in that case, to rule the state. And if you were to correlate that today with the government, with the elected representatives who on behalf of the people run the country. Now, there is a certain guidance for the king of that time. Similarly, let us say there is a by correlation guidance for the governing elite in a country. Could be any country. All right. While the essence of how they must rule, that flows from the idea of dharma. But given that there are certain realities of how a state functions, wherein, let's take an example, you do need spies. You will have external and internal enemies. You cannot necessarily deal with them purely on the ideals of what is pure and correct. You might need to make adjustments which allow you to deal with them in a manner that protects the interests of the state. So, which is why, whether it is Krishna's thought or subsequently the guidance that is given by Bhishma Pitama to Yudhishthir at the end of the war. So, if you were to combine this, there is the idealism that flows from it, and there is a very clear idea of realism that integrates with it. So, the Raj Dharma of the king is therefore the mix of an idealist framework and its very realistic implementation. Now, the challenge that comes is everybody is going to have his own interpretation of what that realist interpretation is. Any state can say, look, I am working for the interests of the state, so whatever I am doing, however wrong it may be perceived by the others, is acceptable. And that this idea can get abused.
It is being in today's world.
Exactly.
We see a good example of these.
Exactly. So, how do you distinguish between the right balance between idealism and realism and the not so right balance? That is the challenge. And so, there are certain principles of guidance that have been spoken about. One is that you do not go around conquering other territories purely for the lure of land or riches, which means one could compare it with the idea of colonization that existed in the past. Now, that in the Mahabharata was considered a dharma, that you go around conquering different territories because you want the land or you want
the resources.
Yeah. Right? That is one. The second is you don't do these things for revenge. The third thing is, you do not do these things for personal ambition and riches. So, if somebody is seeking personal glory, that goes against the very essence of what dharma suggests. So, these are some of the things that it talks about, but I must admit that there can be potentially a very thin line in terms of how you interpret these things in the kind of complex world that we live in. But I think the spirit is very clearly understood whether one wants to abuse it or one wants to follow it. I think everybody who does so is frankly clear in their mind as to what they're doing.
But what do you understand by the phrase everything is fair in love and war? Does it translate as realism as well?
Yes, but with a pinch of salt. So the minute you make a very simplistic sweeping statement of everything is fair in love and war, then any kind of a abuse of the norms will be considered acceptable, right? If you do not see it in a certain context, there's a challenge that it will get abused. And again, if you look at the world around you, you will find that in the name of the interests of the state, safeguarding the state, you will find abuse of these principles taking place. So, while the concept does find relation in the Mahabharata, especially during the war, I think if you were to give it a very sweeping acceptability, then its abuse will become the norm rather than the exception. Now, in the Mahabharata, there are certain clear rules of engagement that are laid down before the war begins. Okay, let's commence with, there are two things. One, the idea of the cause. Was the cause justified for the war as far as the Pandavas are concerned? And that's the argument Krishna makes in the court of Dhritarashtra, and does it very successfully, convincing the vast majority of the audience that they were in the right. So, your cause is established. Next comes the principles of how you need to fight the war. Again, those were decided before the war took place, which is very much akin to the modern thoughts on warfare. Were those principles followed during the war? The answer is not necessarily. And that is where your statement comes in of everything being fair in love and war, where the larger idea of following the principles of achieving the followings of dharma and of justice, you had cutting of corners that was undertaken to defeat your adversary. Because if you had followed those principles of war, the rules of war rather, to the hilt, then while seeking the limited objective of the rules of war, you would have allowed the larger objective of justice. So that is where the balance comes in. So there's a logic why Bhishma is killed the way he is killed. There's a logic why Dronacharya is given the input or the information of Ashwathama having been killed. Right? There's a logic why Duryodhan is hit below the belt, which was against the rules of Gada Yuddha by Bhim. And that logic is that, yes, you are flouting the rules of engagement, but you're flouting the rules of engagement for the larger cause. Can this be abused by interested parties, by powers? True. But yes, this is very much deception, as it does happen in war. But like I said, if you miss the big picture, then you would get the smaller details will tend to become more important than the big idea. And which is what Krishna repeatedly says during the Mahabharata you need to guard against, and which is where he has a disagreement with how, let us say, Yudhishthira agreed to play the game of dice. How Yudhishthira invites Duryodhan at the end of the war to come and fight any Pandav brother, and if he was to win against them, the kingdom will be returned to Duryodhan. Now, these are the limitations of someone going by a certain principle, forgetting the big picture. Right. So that is the balance that needs to be struck.
Since we spoke about deception briefly, I would want to talk about the 4 upayas that Krishna says. What is the significance of these 4 upayas that Krishna uses?
Interestingly, let me just preface this very briefly by saying that the concept of upayas is not limited to the Mahabharata. it gets spoken about or it gets illustrated
In
in
Arthashastra.
the Ramayana. It very much is a part of the Arthashastra, probably in even more detail. So if there is the hierarchy of strategy, you have the ends at the apex, you have the means, and then you have the ways. And that is this cycle of strategy. So if the ends of strategy are the well-being of the people, which comes across through the concept of Yogashema in the Mahabharata, in the Ramayana, in the Arthashastra, it's available everywhere. The ways in which this can be achieved, the Upayas are amongst the ways that have been spoken about in the Mahabharata. And I think the best illustration of these ways is during the course of Krishna's appearance in the court of Dhritarashtra as an emissary of the Pandavas, where he attempts everything from trying conciliation, from trying allurements, from trying to create divisions, even attempting coercion. So, short of war, he attempts everything to try and gain some kind of settlement. It did not work to the extent that it was desired, which is that he could not ensure peace. But he still succeeded in multiple ways. And let's look at what those ways were. One, he was able to gain moral superiority on part of the Pandavas. Like I mentioned earlier, everybody was convinced that, look, they are on the right side of dharma, and it's Duryodhan who's in the wrong. That was one of the achievements of the use of Upayas, right? He was also able to gain a certain level of moral superiority over the adversary. And as we know, as military people, moral superiority for a force which goes into any kind of a conflict is of immense value in terms of how it motivates the forces and how the side is perceived by the others. So he's able to achieve that. So it's not that he was not able to avoid the war. The Upayas are broad-based principles which are timeless. If you were to apply this to any situation, I would say forget about policymakers, forget about diplomats, look at your personal life, look at our social surroundings, and you will realize that multiple times you would have used these without knowing that you're using them. You attempt conciliation, you attempt allurement, you attempt divisions, right? If not necessarily in your personal life, certainly in your professional life, right? Because if you have an adversary, and I'm talking of, let's say, my military life, there would be times where you would attempt to create those divisions, whether it is in counterterrorism operations or on the conventional battlefield, right? So, irrespective of which era of time we are living in, these upayas are timeless. And let me add two more. The fifth one that the Mahabharata speaks about very briefly, but does not get into the details, is called upeksha. Upeksha is, it's a standoffish kind of approach of neglect that you use. So you neglect a particular individual or a situation, right? There is also an upaya which the Mahabharata does not talk about, but is practiced in the Mahabharata, and that is of Maya. The very interesting illusion, yes. So one of the examples of Maya used is by Ghatotkacha during the conduct of the Mahabharata, and he uses all forms of illusion during the conduct of the battle. And it is, it has such a huge impact on the conduct of the war that Karan is forced to use the spear, divine spear that he had been given, and he had kept it to hit Arjun against Ghatotkacha, thereby taking away that major resource from him that he had kept against his primary adversary. Now, the logic of this is again very similar. We may not have those powers of Maya in the conventional sense, but if you were to look at it more in terms of the essence of what the idea is, then you do attempt to outwit the adversary through various means of deception. Deception, yes.
So would you say illusion is deception?
In a sense, yes. In a sense, yes.
It's an extension of it.
Yes.
So I just want to throw an example at you, and if you could tell me the proper ways to deal with the situation through the principles of Krishna that he speaks about in Mahabharata, Gita, as well as that you have understood in your book. 2nd April, we saw an attack at Pahalgam, and we saw some civilians killed. What would have Krishna done in such an instance?
Let's compare this with what Ashwatthama does. Two people who, in the dark of the night, are sleeping in their camp. This includes women, children, warriors without their weapons. And he goes into the camp and undertakes inhuman slaughter. At the end of the slaughter, there is a very concerted campaign on part of the Pandavas to hunt down Ashwatthama. You actually have the use of Brahmastra on both the sides. While Arjun retracts his Brahmastra because he has the powers to do so, Ashwatthama confesses that he does not have that capability. And it does hit the target, unfortunately. Krishna is able to negate its effect through his divine powers. But what he also does is to curse Ashwatthama of thousands of years of, not of death, but of pain through a life which is going to be a miserable life. And I think that should tell us something about what the answer to this kind of barbaric behavior should be. It is a prolonged suffering which must be meted out to the adversary because of the nature of the crime. It may not be immediate. It may not be over a short period of time, but it should not be forgotten, and it should be implemented so that its impact and its influence can be felt by the adversary over a protracted period of time. Which means that if you were to look at it in the more contemporary sense, you have your military instruments. I think we showed how they could be used. It will have a military impact on the adversary. It will have a psychological impact on the adversary. There is public shame of having been hit in their heartland. What must also follow is punishment through other means, whether these are through diplomatic maneuvering, these are through organizations like the Financial Action Task Force, wherein there is a squeeze on the financial systems of the country that must follow. I think there are various means that collectively should be part of that prolonged punishment until the adversary is willing to mend its way.
How do you think India's response has been to the Pahalgam attack and with Operation Sindoor? Do you think we followed some rules of engagement, that the principles that Krishna had
Yes, I
suggested?
think we do. Sometimes we feel that a lot of these things which were talked about in the Mahabharata or the Ramayana or the Arthashastra had a very localized, limited period reality and reference. And which is why I keep emphasizing on the fact that these critical texts, important texts, speak of principles. If you were to focus on the principles, you will find the learnings are relevant today. If you were to focus on very specific examples and solutions, you will obviously not find a correlation, right? So if you were to look at the principles of what I've spoken about in terms of the Ashwatthama example, and if you were to look at what India has been doing over a period of time, I think the essence of the epics is so deeply rooted in our subconscious that even if you do not think that you're following a certain understanding that comes from these epics or from the Arthashastra or from the other texts, I think we instinctively do follow them. It's part of our culture, it is part of our being, it is part of just who we are.
But do you think without a deep understanding of such scriptures, we are able to utilize it in our own life?
I think by instinct we do, but it will certainly help with a deeper understanding. I'm not trying to pitch my book by saying that if you read my book, you get that understanding. But the fact is, you read the text. Everybody who reads the text is going to view it from a certain lens. and which is perfectly fine. View it from whichever lens you want, but read the text, there will be a learning. That to me is a more important takeaway than saying that if you were to read my book, this is the understanding that you're going to get. No. Everybody's understanding is going to be very personal, and it's where you come from is going to tell you where you will go based on what you get out of the book.
One is there any notion after going so deep into the scripture that the people perceive in a normal day-to-day scenario, but is completely true after going deeper with the subject? So,
I give you one example, of course, of detached perseverance. All right. So the other was, I think, related to the decision-making cycle. All of us do that. If I was to ask you, look, you wanted to do this particular thing. Okay, start your podcast channel. What were the steps that you went through at the start and till where you reached? If you were to break down that process, I'm talking about the process, it'll be exactly what can be derived from the Mahabharata. So it begins with the objective. Thereafter, you study the options that are available to you. You evaluate those options, and in your own mind, based on your understanding, maybe input some that you get from your friends, relatives, others, you reach the best option that you find will work for you. Thereafter, you want to ensure its effective implementation, something that you're doing now, right? And after that, there is a system of follow-up. Every time you go through the process, you find that there are certain learnings. You made certain mistakes, you had certain successes. You take those, derive the lessons, and then go back and see how you need to readjust and calibrate your process.
That is the decision-making process that is followed, to my mind, by Krishna in every action that he undertakes. Where that is different and why he succeeds where some others fail is in identifying the correct challenge and in choosing the right option. Interestingly, after the game of dice, when the Pandavas have lost, they go into the jungles. This debate happens. All the Pandavas are there, Krishna is there. And Krishna tells them, look, if I was in your place, there is no way I would have allowed this game that was rigged from the very beginning to take place. And he says, if there was anybody who had attempted to force me, I would have ensured through means, through peace, if necessary, through force, that it did not happen. He says, by allowing what you felt was customary to take place, look where it has led you. So the situation was the same. The options were available to both. The difference was in what you chose. Yudhishthira chose to play the game because he felt that the dharma, the custom of that time was that you cannot refuse when you are invited and you're visiting somebody you invited to a game of dice, you cannot refuse. He said, I know there's going to be a problem. I know there's going to be cheating. But yet he goes on and plays. Krishna says, I wouldn't have done it. Because the larger goal was not to fall for that trap. So the options were available. It's a question of what option you choose. Right? So that, to my mind, is something all of us do in our lives. It is just the nature of evaluation is going to be different based on what person A does, what person B does. So it was a complete echo from what was happening in the Mahabharata.
So an important part of strategy that your book talks about, but strategy is about narrative as well. We often say that history is written by the winners. True. Similar could be in the case of Mahabharata, that because the Pandavas won the bigger conflict, the conflict, the Mahabharata, as we know, it's more biased towards their liking. How does your book teach us to strategize better when it comes to narrative building, especially for a country like India, who is not at the best at creating narratives? especially when I say that after analyzing what happened in Operation Sindoor and how Pakistan took away the victory in the narrative building process.
I wouldn't necessarily agree that Pakistan took away the victory in the narrative building process. They may have had certain successes, but I don't think anybody doubts 3 or 4 key fundamentals that the Indian perspective is based on. One, does anybody doubt the fact that Pakistan uses terrorism as an instrument of state? No. Nobody doubts it. Does anybody doubt, irrespective of what kind of evidence that has been given the history of Pakistan's behavior, that the Pahalgam incident had something to do with the Pakistanis? I think there is nobody who's questioning you on that, right? 3, does anybody doubt the fact that the military impact you were able to create at the target end is fake or contrived? I don't think so. So I think we are giving Pakistan far more than they deserve, merely because we are overly self-critical. And this is a very, very Indian trait. As many words, it is not because they do not understand the situation or are not convinced by what you're saying. They feel that it is in their interest to take a certain ambiguous position. There is a difference between both these things. My adoption of ambiguity and my understanding of the situation can both exist simultaneously. And that, to my mind, is how states will function. It is more important for me to ask myself, how do I create the circumstances or shape the circumstances where I can better influence others to side by my view more vocally and more obviously? That is the question I would ask myself. Let's correlate that with the narrative building process with the Mahabharata, and that might have some answers to it. Let's go back to the entire negotiation process before the war takes place. So there isn't one emissary, there are actually more than one. Sanjay is sent before Krishna comes by Dhritarashtra to the Pandavas, attempting to stall the war. Now what Sanjay takes as a message to the Pandavas is very different. He says, look, you guys have always been on the side of dharma. And as per dharma, war is obnoxious. You've always stood by that principle. Why do you want to go against that principle now? Reject the idea of war, even if you have to be beggars. It is better in life than to go. He also says, like, look, if you had to go for war, you could have chosen war when you fought, you lost the game of dice. He said, why did you have to wait for 13 years? तभी लड़ लेते, अब क्यों लड़ने जा रहे हो? It makes no sense. Don't fight. You know,
It's a valid point.
It's a valid point from one perspective. So that is the essence of the idea that he takes, amongst others, but these are some of the 2 very interesting ideas that he brings to the table. Now, contrast that with what Krishna takes to the table. He establishes the fact that who is righteous and who is not based on the sequence of events that has taken place. And what he uses are irrefutable facts. Right? Sanjay is appealing to a higher notion that is neither realistic nor practical. Right? It's like, all the money that you have, there are so many poor people in the world, why don't you just give me all your money? It's a great idea, but you cannot do it. I doubt you'll do it. So it's like telling the Pandavas, look, forget it, yeah. Why do you need the kingdom? Just give it all away. Don't fight the war for it. Right? Doesn't work in real life. What Krishna does is, he attempts to avert the war through various means. Amongst them, he establishes who is righteous and who is not, and there is nobody in the court who is not convinced, including Duryodhana's parents, mother and father. Yeah. All the elders. all the bystanders who are neutral bystanders and are present in the court. Everybody is convinced. He also convinces them of the fact that, look, here is a very small minority which is hell-bent on the idea of war. The vast majority is not. So it's better that to discard this small minority rather than ensuring that there will be slaughter on both the sides, and slaughter there will be. It's said in the Mahabharata, where there is Krishna, where there is righteousness, there is Krishna. And where there is Krishna, there is victory. Right? So it's not merely because Krishna is on that side. A lot of people say, look, Krishna was there, he led the entire course of deviousness, so it was victory. No. Since he was on the side of the right, victory came. He could have sided with the side of the wrong also. He didn't. So the righteousness is the key to how the thing follows, and this is again part of the narrative that he takes. So if you were to take the essence of what this tells you is, one, your narrative should be based ideally on the key or the seed of righteousness. It always has better chances of success. If your narrative is based on fabrication, as is the case with Pakistan, on duality, on fiction, it won't work. It's not as if there weren't enough people on the side of the Kauravas who fought the war. There will always be people who will side by the wrong for personal reasons, for strategic reasons, for diplomatic reasons, whatever the reasons. So it's not as if the entire side is going to get drawn to your side. That will happen. It happened here in Sindoor as well. Right? But you are always going to have a higher pedestal from where you're going to have your fight. Two, and that is the realistic part. It's always better to fight from a position of strength. Because when Krishna tells something, people had no choice but to listen to him in rapt attention. And there was a sense of fear, apprehension of what would come if the negotiation failed. Right? So, negotiations ideally from a position of strength. You will not always be able to do so. That's the reality of life. And if that is the reality of life, that is where, because you're fighting for the right cause, deception comes in. That is where Ashwathama Mara Gaya comes in. So you may be forced to use deception when you realize that, look, the war of righteousness is stuck in such a situation where you cannot break that balance. You will have to resort to means where you will need to break that balance. And you see nations, you see armies consistently applying deception for the cause that they believe in. And that is also something that is used when it comes to narratives. Right? So these are some of the essential points in which narratives can be derived from the Mahabharata. In addition, I think what we can also speak about, narratives are best created through a centralized authority, rather than allowing everybody to have their own little bit of a small narrative which is going, it doesn't work. So centralized thought, decentralized application. And
which we did pretty much this time.
And I think also if you have a certain flexibility that is allowed over a course of time, that helps in making the requisite adjustments to the kind of narrative that you've chosen for yourself.
Sir, lastly, I want to ask you, because this book is all about strategy and pertaining to anyone, but we would like to use it for our own geopolitical upbringing, I would say. And we see a lot of differences in the landscape in terms of the geography, in terms of China rising, in terms of our threats in our neighborhood, in terms of US trying to counter China, in terms of Russia trying to, counter the West. Because there's so many uncertainties, what should be India's approach? In a very simple, I know it's a very complex question, but if you were to give one suggestion to the policymakers or the people who are running our country, and how to instill the static gems from our ancient wisdom, such as Mahabharata, what would it be?
I think the idea of sticking to the core of dharma, that is of idealism, I think it has served us well. It distinguishes us from the very hard-nosed, abrasive kind of realism that we see across the world. I think even if we were to try it, it's just not who we are civilizationally. So the anchor has to be based on what dharma suggests, and dharma is not constraining, dharma is not limiting. One needs to understand that, and that is where the element of realism comes in. For example, the Mahabharata speaks about circumstances, adverse circumstances, where when someone uses a dharma against you, you can potentially use a dharma against that as well. And it is perfectly acceptable in the larger scheme of things. So, to my mind, the core of who we are and what we are and what our policy is based on is based on dharma, which is righteousness, one of the interpretations. And I think its implementation is allowed through the spirit of realism. So the Indian policy of enlightened self-interest is, I think, in many ways a sound reflection of what the Mahabharata suggests.
Wow. Sir, I would take this opportunity to tell you how proud I am of the work that you've done. One, because I really look up to you as someone who mentors me in different aspects, but also because there aren't many books on the subject of our ancient wisdom, because we have so much knowledge from ancient wisdom, be it Mahabharata, be it Ramayana, or Arthashastra as well. But the saddening part is that we don't have enough scholars on these subjects. If you were to give, any word of advice to the scholars who are looking for subjects to do their research on, if you want to sell them why and how they should focus on our ancient wisdom, because we see a lot of ancient wisdom from China, for instance, Sun Tzu, or some Western civilization or Greek philosophy, but we are not focusing enough on our India's ancient wisdom. If there was a message you want to give to the scholars around India,
share my view in two parts. One, I would say that sometimes when we try to create a force fit with what was in the past, with what is in the present, a lot of people get disillusioned and reject the idea of the ancient wisdom, which is why, going back and repeating it, that seek the principles there, and you will realize that they will show you the path in the present. They don't give you the answer, but they'll show you the path. The second thing is, everyone who reads the Mahabharata is an equal scholar to the so-called scholars like me. Because I think everyone who reads this text will be able to derive lessons from their own perspective that are going to be valuable to them in whichever path that they choose and whatever pursuit that they pick, whether it is strategic affairs or it's any pursuit in life. So I think every reader of this epic is as much a scholar, as much an ambassador of the message that the Mahabharata gives. And to my mind, that should be the way to look at it, rather than a few people either writing about it or speaking about it. I think anyone and everyone who's gone through the story of the Mahabharata is equally equipped to make it a part of their lives.
Yeah. So thank you so much. Always a pleasure, having a conversation with you on different subjects. Today was more special because it was on your book. It was quite insightful for me. I'm sure it's been for the audience as well. And thanks again for your time today, sir.
Thank you. Pleasure, as always.
The link to the book will be found in the description below. Please try to get your hands on it. And until then, keep reimagining yourself and know that the power of change lies within you. Jai Hind.